Welcome, everybody. You're listening to Tough Topics on KUR, and I'm your host, Trisha. I'm the graduate assistant at the Women's Center. I'm in my third and final year of the counseling clinical mental health program. And so I was approached by my supervisor because Mike had reached out to Christine about starting a show about women's issues and the LGBTQ community issues. And so Tough Topics was born out of that. And so each individual episode talks about various issues. Today's episode is going to touch on some privilege information and discussion. There's a lot going on right now, especially with Black Lives Matter, and there's just a lot of polarization, and 100% there's a lot of ignorance out there in regards to what privilege is, and is it real? Is it, XYZ? So, and today I have Carolyn with me. She is our social work intern currently at the Women's Center, and I'll let her introduce herself.
I'm excited to be here. Yeah, my name is Carolyn, and I'm a social work major. I'm an undergrad. I'm in my senior year, and I'm doing my field placement at the Women's Center, so I'm very excited to be here.
I'm excited for our conversation today because our one undergraduate assistant had let me know that you and them had gotten into a really good conversation about your just general experience with femininity and connected to your race and things like that.
And intersectionality.
Yes, thank you. I always forget to use that word.
That's the word you're looking for.
Yes. So yeah, but before we get really involved with our conversation, I am going to do a little event plug as always. So we got coming up on October 7th at 3 p.m. an equality talk. This one is going to focus on Roe versus Wade and if it still matters, and the state of reproductive rights in the U.S. Currently. And that one will feature Dr. Colleen Clemens. She's a WGS faculty professor and is an amazing person. On October 9th, we have at 11 a.m. another session of our Coping with COVID support group hosted by yours truly. On October 13th at 7 p.m., we have an election/voting series from ACLU, and it is called Know Your Rights. So that's some stuff going on for the month of October. It is also National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So keep a lookout on our social media for some extra social media campaigns in terms of that. And we'll be highlighting some stuff from Safe Berks that they've also done in place of the silent witness display and things like that. So yeah, I guess let's get her going. And so, I mentioned that the show is going to focus on privilege, but one of the components of my shows is always kind of more of like a educational part, which is like, what is the topic that we are talking about and what does it really look like? So like, what is privilege technically? Interestingly, I always do like just a quick Google search for whatever the topic is. And I'm so interested to see what Google says as the definition. So it included a definition of, the definition of privilege according to just the Google one is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. And I feel like that definition is correct, obviously, but I also feel like privilege itself is so personal and so it's conceptualized very differently among each individual. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think it does. I think often when people hear that word, it's kind of off-putting because people just think, oh, like you're attacking me, or they're like, oh, I suffer with this and I have this going on, and you're saying these things about me. You're making a lot of these assumptions. And I feel like sometimes when we break things down into studies, we just kind of look at them as like facts and numbers, but we don't coordinate it enough. We don't link it enough with what we're experiencing personally. Because sometimes if you've never had to look at things from someone else's perspective, you're not even aware of the advantages that you might have. So when people are saying, oh, another group has all these disadvantages, there's not usually like a personal aspect to it where you're like, where you could see what the other person is seeing. You just think of all these statistics and facts, and you're just like, oh, well, how does that relate to me? Like, I don't feel it personally going on in my life. Like, I don't see it. You're just telling me these things. So I think that's why it's, um, I don't know. I think that's why sometimes people, like white people, I guess, or people in like positions where that have privilege, they don't like to really acknowledge that word. They don't see it on a personal level. They don't have to think about it.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up the point of like how the word privilege has become like a hot button statement. Like you say it and it creates a big reaction typically from someone, someone that may not be aware of their privilege and feels attacked for it being called out. Um, and I never know how we get here. I never know how we got to a point where we can't have a conversation about privilege without it creating those big reactions, because those big reactions prevent people from personally understanding what it is. There's been a lot of moments where I've realized the places that I have privilege over others. And sometimes it sucks because I don't want it to be that way. Like I don't want that. I didn't ask for that. And it is hard when you have to like, I don't know how to explain it.
I sometimes like, I don't know, because I feel like I deal with it from both sides, and I don't know like how you feel about your identity, but like I know there's like, for me as someone who I lack certain privileges, it kind of feels, I don't know, sometimes I'm just like, I don't really call out people for anything. Like, because I see myself and I know there's certain ways that I don't have advantages, and those make me like, those, I feel bad about it sometimes. But since I know there's so much that I do have, just in terms of like nationality and class, and right now, just understanding that I'm one of the few people in like the world that are like receiving an education, all those things, I often more focus on like what I do have. So like I'm usually the person, and I know we're talking about like white privilege, but in terms of just class and educational status and all these things and being an able-bodied person, I often think of the things that I do have. So a lot of the times I go through processes that like they talk about it in terms of like white people and race and stuff, but I don't know if you've experienced this, but just like feeling guilty over it and really not knowing what to do and feeling uncomfortable, just being like, oh, I have these things, but like, and I feel bad, but then like, how do you go from taking that guilt to actually like doing something about it, and not even just like shaming yourself or like trying to like call out people all the time, like, but just being like, okay, what can I like practically do to do better myself and to like make some type of difference how I can to make
Mm-hmm.
things a little better.
Absolutely. Um, I think when we talk about, or when someone mentions the word privilege, I think our minds do automatically kind of jump to the concept of white privilege. And I did a Google search on that as well, of course. Um, Google defines white privilege as inherent advantages possessed by a white person on the basis of their race in a society characterized by racial inequality and injustice. Um, and while that is still like a pretty like, in my mind, a top tier like issue, like white privilege needs to be addressed pretty bad. I think you also mentioned though, like how important it is also to understand your other types of privileges and how they do lead to feelings of guilt. I mean, I come from a higher socioeconomic status in my family, and I've met people that outwardly feel angry towards people that have more money than them. And I remember sitting there like feeling like I didn't mean it. Like I didn't it's not, I didn't try that. Like, this isn't something I like had control over. And I think that fuels my desire to want to help others. And so, like you were saying, like there's this level of guilt and you're kind of like, well, what do I do with this? Well, it's like what inspires me to not be stingy with my money and like be giving and like give to others as much as I can. Because I know that there's people out there that are struggling more than I am.
Mm. Yeah, it definitely teaches me to like be humble. Yeah, and to just like want to know better and do better because I can't kind of like unsee it. Like I know it's there. Like I can kind of ignore it, but at the same time, there are moments, depending on the information that I search out, I see it so clearly, and I'm just like, okay, well, now I feel like I kind of need to do something about it. That's just like on the side of like being a privileged person. I know, obviously we lack privileges in ways, and I don't know if you mind, but I kind of wanted to ask about like your experiences with I know you're like a cis identifying woman, but like
Mm-hmm.
um have there been moments where like you kind of had to deal with, like, when did you realize that, oh, I'm a part of this group and therefore people perceive me in a lesser way, or I get um a lesser deal, I get a worse deal out of this lot because of these certain things? And what was your process towards like understanding that and what that like meant to you? Sorry.
That's okay. So I feel like I have experiences with understanding my lack of privilege as a woman, like as a cisgender identified woman, and uh, how my gender identity and expression are feminine. How, you know, women are paid less. They are often catcalled and harassed and sexually harassed, and being a woman comes with its like own unique issues. And I don't know if I necessarily remember a specific time that I came to realize like those things, um, because I interestingly grew up with a family and a dad that like always told me to use, like he called it, he's like, you can speak up for yourself and use your jalap mouth and like make and like stand up for yourself. So I was taught like kind of the opposite of what most women are taught, and that's to sit down and to shut up. I had the opposite experience. But your question also made me think about moments that I like realized the privilege that I do have in other aspects of my life. So as a cisgender identified person, someone that also appears or presents heterosexually, I realized the privilege in those because I don't walk into a room and think twice about my safety. Mm-hmm. I could take that a step further and say I also don't think twice about my safety because the color of my skin.
Definitely.
I pass by cars that are pulled over and I check what skin color they have, and if I see that this might be messed up, I don't know. If I see that they have white skin, I'm like, they'll be fine.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Granted, that's not always the case. That's not always true, but most often and most commonly, it will be fine. I had dated a person that was trans identified, and I was fortunate that I got to hear some of his experiences. Even so, I've had the opportunity as if like, I don't know. Another moment where I like kind of really understood my privilege as someone that, one, is perceived as heterosexual and two, is a cisgender woman, is when I dated my ex, who is trans identified. And we never like, I never, while we were out in public, I never experienced like people being rude to him. But I definitely like experienced him getting misgendered quite often in the beginning.
Mm.
And or like when we'd go out, once he turned 21, before he like had his official name change, he'd have to present his ID, and his ID obviously did not have the name that he went by, and it doesn't have the like the gender markers doesn't match up with what's presented in person. And I thought to myself, like, how one of my layers of privilege is I never have to think about or think twice about presenting an ID.
Yeah.
I don't know. So I feel like I have on like two hands. Like on one hand, I have my lack of privilege as a woman, with being sexually harassed and not having as much access to certain jobs, or being assumed that I'm going to work a certain job. And then on the other hand, I have privilege in my gender identity and in my perceived sexuality.
Mm.
And I feel like we kind of hinted at this before, just, how much privilege, your different types of privileges and where they come from, how much they intersect. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. I think that's why um I think it's made me more empathetic in terms of like realizing that there's things I lack, but there's also a lot of things that I have. And that means that there's things that I'm able to like do, and not using, not just feeling bad about it and just sitting there with the guilt, but being like, okay, well, then what can I do to like help? Like, how can I do better? It forces me to like want to do better. And then in terms of like not having the privilege, see, I guess for me, why I kind of feel like it's just hard for me to call people out, especially like in terms of white privileges. I know that with growing up, like I kind of grew up in like kind of a different environment than you, in terms of, you were saying like you were empowered, like your dad always empowered you as like a woman. Like the environment I grew up in, it was very like toxic in terms of race. It was just like the school I went to specifically, like it was just a very hostile, like racist place. So I struggled a lot with my identity and kind of just feeling empowered as a kind of a Black person. So I feel like a lot of the work that I've had to do have kind of been like internal, to kind of take back my identity and how I feel about myself. So I guess that's why sometimes um it's harder for me to call people out on things, because I know that despite knowing all the like facts and figures and everything, for me it's a much more personal experience, if you know what I mean. So like I'll obviously like shut someone down if they're being like racist and stuff, and I don't really like people who are like toxic near me or whatever. So their beliefs, like I kind of always just be like, oh, I'm not really gonna go here, or I'm not gonna like bother with you because you don't represent the type of person that I want to be around. But at the same time, for me, like in terms of not having privilege, especially like white privilege, it's a very personal thing. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, like how do I undo all the negative things that I like learned about myself?
So you saying all of that like made me realize how much like you can come about understanding your privilege almost kind of like in one of two ways. Either you get to discover it on your own in your own terms, and not because something bad happened to you, or you learn your privilege or your lack of privilege because of something bad happening. So like when you were mentioning about like how like the school that you went to and how like they were really racist, and that kind of like forced you into this like conversation within yourself about your privilege or your lack of privilege. and what that looks like for you. Whereas I got to discover my privilege on a very casual basis, not because I was being discriminated against or facing prejudice or things like that. And I feel like that's also just another level or layer of privilege.
Yeah, no, that's true. Like how you're introduced to it. Um, yeah, I think how you're introduced to it, I think it's like impactful. I think depending on how we approach people about things, I think that can either um put them off or like kind of get them to think more deeply about it. I think people should always be challenged, and I think, it is up to us. It's up to everyone to like try and challenge each other. Um, but I think in the end, if you're a person, whatever you have privilege in, I think it is ultimately like your responsibility to seek out um, the information or to try and understand the group that like is the one that's like suffering or in a position where they're they're like receiving less and perceived as less. Like I don't know. I think yeah, I think that's mainly like a responsibility or a decision you make. Um, but I do think how the topic is approached and talked about can be like just initially at least like off-putting, or it can make you think deeper. So I think people who are in these spaces where they understand things, I think it does matter how we approach people about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, oh, there's so many things that I want to respond to there. I I don't know how much I could say or like how much I can emphasize that it is not Black people's responsibility to end racism.
Exactly.
It is not Black people's responsibility to teach white people what privilege is and how they are privileged based on their skin color. And it's frustrating that that responsibility just always gets pushed. And the way I can relate to that is how sexual assault is perceived more as like a woman's issue and not a man's issue. Like it is always, for whatever reason, the woman's responsibility to dress, act, and behave in a certain way, when like we're not focusing on the actual problem, and it's that we don't teach men not to be disrespectful.
Exactly.
And I definitely would I 100% agree with like how we approach conversations around these hot button issues is really important, but it's really hard when like right now everything is so polarized and just so high emotion. Most people just automatically go into it with a mindset that they're going to be attacked.
Mm.
And that's like an issue in itself that I don't know how to like address and like unpack.
Do you do you think it's genuine, or I don't know if gaslighting is the proper term, but do you think sometimes people, I don't know, because the people I at least grew up around of, and maybe you're not talking about the same people, but like if we're talking about the people that are just like they completely don't want to talk about it and they're turned off to it and they're like, oh, like I feel like sometimes it's just used to disregard people's feelings. Yeah, so sometimes I don't know how genuine it is, whether it's just like you really are like scared to just get called out, and like, because I feel like the person who genuinely is like very like worried about like, oh well, I don't want to come off as this way, or I don't want to be perceived this way, I feel like they're the people that tend to also listen the most, you know what I mean, versus like someone who's just like, oh well, I don't want to hear about this. So like, are you speaking in terms of people who are like they don't know how to approach it the right way but their intentions are good, or are you talking about people who just like you think they're disregarding it because they're just trying to shut down the conversation? Because then it's like, are those people even worth convincing to a certain extent?
I feel like I'm thinking more of like the second group that you mentioned. And I think in my head, like, I can think of many people that I see on my Facebook feed that are just resistant to conversation because they don't want to be wrong.
Mm.
And I don't know when like that really, I mean, I could probably say when that started, and it could be maybe something to do with our current administration. I don't know. We won't go there, but I also like, I feel like we keep kind of touching on, but we're not outwardly talking about how being able to ignore your privilege is also a privilege.
Oh, exactly.
And that's another one that I think people are really not necessarily sure how to digest. They're like, well, and I don't even know how to unpack that either.
No, that's true. No, it's weird. That's why that's why we agreed on that. I think the ultimate responsibility is up to them. Like even if you're just ignorant, like like it's still up to you, like whether you want to like stay that way. Like I get it. It's kind of just like people are like afraid. But even then you don't have to jump to it right away. You could just like listen. And yeah, maybe like in our spaces for people who like have had that information and have been informed in it like a while, I do agree that like sometimes we could appear condescending, like sometimes, depending on how you go about it. But who cares? Just like like to the person that doesn't know, or if you want to do better, like something might not be delivered to you perfectly, but if you care about it, it's still your responsibility. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and yeah, I'm not like perfect or anything. Like, there's so many things that like I don't know, and like there's a lot of people that could call me out, like, hey, like you're not acknowledging this. Like, I think specifically with like ableism, like when's the last time I've even like looked things up about that and what people are going through and everything. Like, it was only until I did a paper for one of my classes that I even really even heard of the term and everything. So like, if someone wanted to call me out on that, yeah, it would make me feel bad, but they would still be right. So it would still be up to me on what I want to do with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a thought and then I lost it. I think, I wanted to react to the part where you said like, well, so sometimes we do come off as condescending, but like, who cares? And I feel like at this time, there is no more room for caring. Like, there is no more room for trying to be compassionate in terms of these conversations, because these conversations, one, need to be had. And so like, if you're coming into a conversation and you're starting to feel a little butthurt about like the reality of the current situation with Black Lives Matter and how like systemically we are still very racist as a country, and our country was literally built on racism. If you find yourself getting butthurt about that, you got to check yourself. Like, you really like have to sit there and think about where your feelings are coming from.
Yeah.
Granted, not everyone has that insight and that like ability to be self-reflective, and I think that could be another layer of why these conversations aren't being had or why they're difficult to have.
No, I agree. Like in those moments, it just be like, all right, well, I'm feeling this way, but then think about how the other person might be feeling. Just, I remember, for my residence life training, that was actually one of the stages. It was talking about, it was specifically talking about like white privilege, and it was kind of just like, all right, you get to this point where you're thinking, oh my God, well, I'm so uncomfortable and I don't want to feel this way, and you're kind of in the and that's an issue because then you're centering yourself, you're centering your own feelings. Like, it's okay to just acknowledge those feelings, but then being like, okay, this isn't about me. Like, all right, I feel uncomfortable, but this is just like an after effect. Like, this is something I'm gonna have to work through, but I shouldn't center it in what's going on, because then I'm making it about me.
I feel like a lot of times the reason why it's so hard to get out of that like it being like sitting there and feeling uncomfortable and focusing on your specific feelings is because it's never happened to them. And like, that's the whole point. And I don't know like how to get people to understand that like that's it. Like, I'm uncomfortable because I'm being called out for something that maybe I personally have never had a hand in, but growing up, and like there's a lot of roots in racism in our country. So like, while me as a white person, I have tried to actively be more inclusive and not be racist and do all the things that I can try to do to be better. But that doesn't mean that as a collective, white people are not racist. And I think it's same with sexual assault. And like, I know I keep kind of like, but this is how I like kind of conceptualize all of it. People don't think sexual assault isn't, they don't think it's real if it's not happening to them. Well, that doesn't happen on our college campus. No, it does. It just didn't happen to you yet, because the likelihood of you being sexually assaulted is actually very high. But people get scared of that conversation too.
By people you know also. That's another thing. Not just like a stranger in a dark alley, but people you intimately know the most.
Yes. And like people that are kind of like resistant to understanding privilege, I'm like, you're not having the right conversations with the people of color in your life. If the people in your life are not opening up to you about their experience, not even like in a teaching way, but just being honest about like their own experience with racism in this country, then most likely you are doing or saying something that doesn't make them feel comfortable, or saying to them, that they can't talk about that. And that's the same thing with sexual assault, or even miscarriages. I don't know if you know this, but 1 in 4 women will also have a miscarriage, but that is also something we don't talk about. And it's because our society kind of like sweeps that under the rug too.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like you also mentioned like how the moment we start feeling uncomfortable in these situations, we start focusing on like our feelings about it. And I just instantly thought of like, oh, we can't handle sitting here uncomfortable for like 5 minutes with this conversation, but yet like people of color go out there and are living uncomfortable situations all the time.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was about to say. I was like, all right, well, if you're feeling this way, sit with this feeling, and then realize that someone has to deal with this on like a daily basis, and they've had to work through those feelings like their entire lives. Like, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And like what you were saying about like, if you're not like having the right conversations, I also think you're not putting yourself in the right spaces. It's probably because you've never had to experience being uncomfortable, because you've kind of always been shielded because you're near people who look like you or share the same whatever as you. You know what I mean? Like, you're not intentionally going out to like seek these things, because people who have privilege, like in white people, it's kind of like they dominate the main space. So that's like a choice for them. And I feel like they know that, because when they are uncomfortable, they when they do get to those places, they're like, oh, well, I don't want to feel this way. So I feel like they know. So if you're thinking I'm uncomfortable now, then think like, oh, all the times that you have been comfortable. So it's just like, so kind of know that you occupy a lot of space. Kind of know like, hey, I have to take myself out of this. Like, it's a good thing that I'm uncomfortable. I have to seek out these positions where I'm not just like the majority, and I get to like experience different things that like other people are just forced to deal with. Like, they don't really have a choice because they're the minority. Like, I don't know. It's just like an empathy thing. I feel like just knowing that like someone else goes through this every day.
Absolutely. And I feel like this conversation kind of leads us to talk about something that I thought would be interesting to discuss, and it's and apparently you're not the only one that hasn't really seen this go around. There was and I literally put like in my outline the trendy A Guide to White Privilege. So we're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about that, because one of the first infographics says white privilege doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard. It just means that your skin tone isn't one of the things that's making it harder. And I feel like that's kind of, I thought of that as soon as you were like, when we started talking about like the uncomfortability and things like that. So like I said, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Tough Topics on KUR, and we'll be back shortly. Okay, so welcome back. You're listening to Tough Topics on KUR. I'm your host, Trisha, and I have with me Caroline, our social work intern here at the Women's Center. And if you're just tuning in now for whatever reason, that is okay. Just a little quick recap. We talked a lot about privilege and just, I don't even know how to summarize what we just talked about, because there were so many different aspects that were touched on. We touched on how it's not Black people's responsibility to teach white people privilege, and that when you start to feel uncomfortable about your privilege, check yourself, because most likely, actually not most likely, there are people out there that have endured a lifetime worth of uncomfortability and just not good times. So prior to the break, I had mentioned that we were going to talk about this, like, a social media trendy a guide to white privilege. Before we really jump into that, I want to like mention and have a little conversation about how people that are in marginalized communities can still enact discrimination against other marginalized individuals. So a really good example would be, there's a lot of phobias within the LGBTQ community itself. You can see some, for example, people that identify as bisexual, there's some lesbians that will not get with a bisexual woman if that bisexual woman has had penetrative sex with a man. And that's, I think, known as like the golden star thing within the community. Trans people also tend to face a little bit more discrimination within the LGBTQ community as well. My ex-partner talked a lot about that and whatnot. So, marginalized people are not immune to enacting hateful and discriminatory stuff.
Yes, I find that fascinating. I find that fascinating.
I know you like made a little sound when I mentioned the bisexual and lesbian thing. Were you aware of that?
No.
Yes, that's a thing that happens.
Yeah, no. I would have never understood that as someone who's like not really a part of the community. No.
Mm-hmm. Biphobia is very common. Actually, like if a woman, like a cis woman, is dating a man and she identifies as bisexual, sometimes her sexuality will be discredited because like she's dating a cis man. Like she's technically in a heterosexual relationship, so they're like, oh, you must not be bi. And it's like, that's not how sexuality works. Sorry.
Oh, I got you.
So, yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, it could go like either way. It could make you more empathetic, or you could still be like, oh, well, whatever I'm going through, I'm still different or better than this other group. So I found that fascinating.
Yeah, because I know you had mentioned that you were kind of like doing some research into the community, since that was something you weren't necessarily like super versed in.
Oh, do you mean research into what specifically?
Oh, I was just meaning like, I thought you had mentioned that you had done some research about the community itself, like just generally. Or did you say that you did something specific? I forget.
Oh, I don't remember.
That's okay. Okay, I think now would be a good time to transition our conversation to the guide to white privilege. I apparently cannot say that. And so I had originally seen this come up when Black Lives Matter really took off, when the murder of George Floyd happened. And I had shared it on my Facebook. I'll put that out there. I shared this because of all the things that were being posted and shared, I felt like this could be one that I think could be helpful, because I have some mixed feelings about social media usage and protesting. I don't know. Like sometimes I don't know how much sharing all these posts really help make a movement move forward, but I know that Black Lives Matter has also been pretty social media heavy based, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the best learning that happens are the conversations that you have with other people that are experiencing these things. So, but when I shared it, the one thing I noticed was that I didn't necessarily look hard into it. Like I didn't look at it and like analyze what it was really saying. And I had mentioned before the break that the first one says that white privilege doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard. It just means that your skin tone isn't one of the things making it harder. There's plenty of other privileges: socioeconomic, male, heterosexual, cisgender, Christian, able-bodied. But white privilege is perhaps the most enduring throughout history. And I think that's when I said earlier about how I think white privilege kind of is at the top of the list for me in my head of like what we need to tackle. It's because it's so invasive.
Yeah, I think it creates a lot of the foundations of this country. Like that's I know like there's always been talks about like, oh well, why can't we just why can't we just handle the socioeconomic conditions and just focus on class? Then that will like address also Black issues, but that won't really cut it because there's just such a specific way, like throughout history, that just Black people have been marginalized and discriminated against. That's just like class won't really only cover it. And it's just, it goes beyond like economics. It's just like social systems, you know what I mean? Like those don't even work. Like right now, with we're seeing with like police and even mass incarceration, it's just so ingrained into everything, just like our policies and the way we think. So I don't know. I like how they said like most enduring throughout history because like so much of wealth was just built on like slavery and further exploitation. So yeah,
absolutely.
No, yeah, it's really embedded into at least the U.S.
And I think this, like the main quote part of this, where it's like, it doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard. I think this is getting at what we are talking about with feeling uncomfortable in these conversations of like, well, my life has been hard too. I was poor and I was maybe they were sexually assaulted. I don't know, but like it's like, whoa, hold on. Like that's not what we're saying. Like your life can be hard, but your skin tone is not making it harder. Like I said, when I pass by someone that's getting pulled over, yeah, it sucks to get pulled over, but like I've never feared for my life when I get pulled over. Well, I've only been pulled over once, and I was here we go. I have an example. I was pulled over. I was in high school at the time. I was speeding in the school zone. I was let off with a warning.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And like, I know that there's people out there that would be like, yeah, that's not anything special. And it's like, it kind of is. Because there's nothing right now protecting Black people when they get pulled over that wouldn't happen, that they wouldn't face a higher charge, or they wouldn't get arrested, or their car wouldn't be searched.
Exactly. You don't know how that situation might have went if you were a different person. You just never know.
So like I said, yeah, getting pulled over sucks, but like, think about it. Do you fear for your life when you get pulled over? And you don't have to answer that. That was like a rhetorical question. So number 2 in this, like, there's 5 of them technically, I think. So it says white privilege exists as a direct result of both historic and enduring racism, biases, and practices designed to oppress people of color. I feel like that's kind of a lot to unpack. And then there's a little like diagram at the bottom of like a balance, and on the left side it is being weighed down by a bigger ball, and the ball includes slavery, 3 out of 5 person segregation. I don't know what that says at the bottom.
Yeah, the scale's a little hard to see.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Slavery, 3rd person segregation, redlining,
What
black
is
codes.
what is redlining?
Oh, really? You okay? So no, it's okay. Like, so from what I understand of it, like from what I like Googled in the past, it's basically like when the government was giving out like mortgages to like build houses in the suburbs, so a large percent of Americans could like own homes, which is like a large source of wealth, being able to like pass down your home to your children and
Hmm.
being able to like make money from it, all those types of things. Black people were like really left out of that because in those areas, either like the black people like they weren't really receiving loans, they were being discriminated against for loans to buy houses, and basically where a large swath of black people like lived and aggregated, they wouldn't really try and build homes in those areas. Like there's specific areas where it was very intentional that like, hey, a black person's not really gonna live here, like they can't move into this neighborhood, we're only selling homes to like white people. um
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and it was very like official, like they were official about it, and I think the government either like played a large role in it and just, if not supporting it, but just turning a blind eye, and it not really being considered discrimination until like kind of I can't give you a specific date, but they've been like doing that officially for a while. And even when they like outlawed it, they said you can't do this anymore. It's still kind of, although it's not written into law, there's like obviously things where it's just like if a person moves into this neighborhood, well, is it an issue? How hard it is? How easy is it? Like we're still segregated in
Mm-hmm.
many different ways. Like it's still sometimes unofficially practiced, like even though it's not into law.
Mm-hmm.
I said a lot of things. That was messy, but that's kind of
No, I thought it was great. I feel like I was told about redlining before, and so it sounded really familiar, but then as soon as you started mentioning it, it definitely came back to me. And I think that's a beautiful example of literally like how like systematically our society and our country has like been oppressive towards people of color.
yeah, we're still very segregated even today with just housing and schools. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's still like that. So like, and that's, yeah, that's from like history, and even now and officially we still do things that lean towards those practices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if we go on to number 3, it says white privilege means you actively benefit from the oppression of people of color.
Ooh,
This one's
yeah.
a this one's a big one.
Yeah, that one's big.
I hate this one. Because I hate it not because like I don't want to talk about it. I hate it because like this sucks. Like it, I don't know, this shouldn't be a thing, but um
No, I totally get what they mean. It basically means that like if just kind of by existing and not making an active change, like keeping the status quo, you're kind of contribute, like you have to like make an active change to redo the system, because if things stay the same, you know, eh, you're gonna kind of benefit from it.
mhm,
I get what it
yeah.
means. I get why that. I get if you don't like. I get if you're not familiar with the topic, how that might come across as very like, why are you picking on me just for existing? I get that. And
And I
it's like,
think,
yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
go. No, you can keep going.
Yeah, kind of like back to what you're saying, like, hey, I'm not directly responsible for this, so why are you picking on me type of thing. I get that.
It's hard because like I benefit from this because of like people before me, and like I don't know how to explain like what's happening in my head right now, but some of the examples that this little like infographic uses is that you were like white people. So when it says you are, they're referring to white people. So white
Mhm.
people are the dominant representation on all media, and this is like seeing a lack of inclusivity within like acting roles or commercials. If you like look at commercials, you something I'd never really thought about was how many of them are mostly white people. Like probably I would probably say 98%. I think we've worked towards trying to make it like 95%, but and another one is your actions aren't perceived as those of your race. So like again, with sexual assault, like if a white guy commits sexual assault, it's never equated with their race. But Black people were literally lynched, or like Black men were lynched on false allegations of sexual assault.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I like to kind of think of this one as like, I just want to be a good social citizen. Like, I know it sounds corny, but just I'm like, there's so many things out there in the world that like I don't directly have a hand in, or that, you know, I'm just like, well, I'm not directly responsible for this, but I know that I benefit from it so much that I'm just like, well, someone has to do something about this. Someone has to care enough. Let me just do my part, you know? Maybe I can't make it my whole life mission, but you know what? Let me try and do something. I don't know. That's just how, that's like, if I was a white person, that's how I would view that. That would be what would help me digest that.
That's a good way to think of it, I think. Move on to number 4. Systemic racism exists at every level of society. And some of the examples that they use are the wealth gap, 90% white owned, 10% people of color owned. Black graduates are 2 times more likely to be unemployed. Black Americans are 30% more likely to get pulled over, like I mentioned. Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended. Black Americans make up to 40% of the prison population. I think you had touched on that one a little bit. Or am I wrong?
Yeah, with mass.
Yes, mass incarceration.
Yeah. I was I hope like with everything going on with like fighting for police brutality, because I know that prison system is also part of the criminal justice system. I hope that also gets a chance to be like reformed, because I know it's much harder to fight for those types of things, because people can always be like, oh well, they did something wrong, but that's also part of the conversation. Like I don't know if you've ever seen the 13th, but like it really talks about like the prison industrial complex and like how incarceration, it's like, it's kind of like historic how like Black people have kind of been criminalized, and Black men like our actions, and how we're like targeted more, like the same crimes that like a group of white people and Black people may commit. Black people are like sentenced much harder. They're punished much harder. There's like a whole history behind it. Like that's just another thing. Like all these things have like meanings and terms. Like if you're really willing to sit down and just like a basic Google search, like I'm not even being condescending, but like if you really like care and stuff, like whoever's listening, just Google some of these things. Like with anything else, there's like so much history behind all of it.
You know, it'd be really dumb of me to have invited another white person to talk about privilege today, because that's not, you know, that's not going to make understanding any easier. I can be more than not racist by actively being anti-racist. That one I feel like could also be its own whole show. And lastly, I can confront racial injustices even when it's uncomfortable. We've talked a lot about that today. So, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done, but it can be done.
Yeah, no, definitely. And another thing I would add in there is like just try putting yourself in spaces where like you're not the main one taking up space, and just it's just very humbling where like other people, they have experiences different from your own, and they're the main ones occupying that space. You know, obviously make sure like you're welcomed, but like if you are, just, you know, just being there and just being like, oh, you know, not everything's about me. Like people have different experiences from me. Let me listen and try to see what that's like. I don't know. I feel like that's one really good thing that I've just been trying to practice in my everyday life just with various different groups that I may not be familiar with or that they don't get to be seen a lot. Just being like, okay, what is this about?
Mm-hmm. I think that is a really great ending thought. Is if you're going to take anything away from this episode, just try to listen. Try to listen to other people's experiences and journeys and, you know, their thoughts on things with an open mind, and not like come from a place of being defensive, because the more we sit here and open and listen to each other, the more understanding that will happen. And I think the more compassion will come out of that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all we got for you guys today. If you're listening in, and if you didn't get a chance to listen to all of it and you only listened to 5 minutes, it will also be available eventually on YouTube and Spotify. But I appreciate everyone tuning in for Tough Topics with Trisha, and I will catch you on the first Friday of November. Thank you.